आज तो वर्कप्लेस में हम आपको मिला रहे हैं एक बहुत ही खास हस्ती से। ये है निर्मल्या कुमार, लंदन बिजनेस स्कूल में मार्केटिंग के प्रोफेसर और टाटा सन्स की ग्रुप एग्जीक्यूटिव काउंसिल के मेंबर। निर्मल्या कुमार दुनिया के टॉप 5 मार्केटिंग स्पीकर्स में से हैं। इन्होंने मार्केटिंग स्ट्रेटजी और मैनेजमेंट पर कुल 7 किताबें लिखी हैं, जिनके लिए गूगल पर इन्हें 11,000 साइटेशंस मिले हैं। निर्मल्या एक बेहतरीन प्रोफेसर हैं और बतौर कंसल्टेंट, कोच और स्पीकर वो 60 देशों में दुनिया की 50 फॉर्च्यून 500 कंपनीज के साथ काम कर चुके हैं। निर्मल्या को मार्केटिंग साइंस, मैनेजमेंट और ग्लोबल थिंकिंग पर अपने विचारों और स्टडी के लिए कई अवार्ड भी मिले हैं। दुनिया के नामी 20 स्कूल्स में निर्मल्या स्टूडेंट्स के साथ अपने अनुभव बांट चुके हैं और आज हम उनसे CNBC आवाज पर मार्केटिंग, मैनेजमेंट और लीडरशिप पर बात करेंगे।
Dr. Kumar, welcome to the Workplace Show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aparna, for interviewing me today. It's a pleasure to be with you and your viewers.
You've been writing a lot about global brands, and you mentioned in your book Brand Breakout that global brands are necessary for a developing economy. So why should local brands not be sufficient? Why is it important for brands to be global for an economy to develop?
Today, most of the markets are free and open. So whether it's China or India, we have global competitors in our domestic market fighting for our domestic customers. Now, if I'm just a local player and a local brand, then I'm competing on a small playground versus a global competitor who's competing on a vast canvas. So for example, even if I take India, we think India is a very large market, but it's only 2 to 3% of the total global GDP. So a global Indian player has to make all their return on investment on 2 to 3% of the global market, whereas a company like Unilever or Procter & Gamble or Coca-Cola or Apple are playing on 100% of the canvas, which means that if you're a local brand, you just cannot be as efficient in terms of your innovation, R&D expenses, you cannot be as efficient in terms of your marketing expenses, you can't be as efficient in terms of your production. A domestic only player becomes disadvantaged when they need to be globally competitive, even if they wish to be only a domestic player. So the big problem is, it's a scaled problem, that if you are going to be only a local player, you'll have a very small portion of the world market to play in compared to the large global canvas that is available to global players.
So this is a lesson that Chinese companies seem to be imbibing taking very seriously from all accounts from your book. And you said they're very ambitious. Do you really see the next wave of brands coming out from China, just like it was Japan and Korea earlier?
The first reason for Chinese companies to go global is that the Chinese model has been perfected over 40 years. That model has been based on the fact that we have low labor costs and an unending supply of labor that comes into manufacturing. Now the problem that's happening over the last decade, it's been happening slowly over 40 years, but it's become really big over the last decade, is that labor costs in China have been expanding now at 15% per year over the last decade. Secondly, all the labor that was coming from the rural areas into these factories. That absorption process in the last 40 years has now been completed, so that now China has started seeing a decline in population. All the rural manpower has been absorbed in manufacturing, which means that when I was visiting Chinese factories, for example, the factory of Haier or the factory of Media or the factory of Galans, they all kept talking about labor shortages they were facing, which means that the old model of producing cheaply for the rest of the world has a sell-by date. And so the Chinese companies that are far seeing have already realized that they need to go what we call in business higher up in the value-added chain. And part of going higher up in the value-added chain is developing a brand and selling a brand. So that's why you're seeing a big transformation taking place, where many contract manufacturers are starting to dream of becoming a brand. The other thing to remember is that there has been, as you mentioned, no country has economically developed without also having some global brands come out of it. It happened to Japan, it happened to South Korea. 50 years ago, you would have told me Japan will have global brands. We would have thought this can't be. If 25 years ago you would have said South Korea would have global brands, we would have said this cannot be. But today you see Sony, Toyota, Hyundai, LG, a plethora of brands coming out of these two countries. And there is little doubt that the next set of brands that are going to start hitting the Western markets really hard are the Chinese brands. And you're already starting to see the first signs of them in companies like Haier, Lenovo, Galans, Pearl River Piano. A company like Galans has 40% of the world microwave market. A company like Haier has 8% of the white goods market. A company like Pearl River Piano has 15% of the global piano market. And Lenovo is the world's market leader in computers and laptops. So you are starting to see that process. And Chinese companies have no choice. At some stage, they realize that they have to become more than about just cheap price.
So then now what is the implication for Indian companies? I mean, of course, there are many Indian companies that are going global. We talk about frugal innovation and we talk about the Indian model. But really, I mean, how do you compare and characterize what's happening in India with what you see happening in China?
The Indian companies that are going global, once I take out the B2B companies, because of course there are many very good companies that are going B2B globally. I also take out the companies which are going global by buying a brand abroad. So like a Jaguar Land Rover bought by Tata Motors, that's not building a brand, that's just buying one. So once you take out those two, then it comes to consumer brands in the West. There, I think to see a blockbuster brand from India is going to be quite some time. I don't know if it's going to happen in the next decade. What you are seeing are Indian brands doing 2 or 3 different things. First thing you're seeing is a lot of Indian brands developing brands in other emerging markets. Sure. So you'll see Tata Motor trucks all over the emerging markets. You'll see Godrej. You'll see your VIP also. You'll see a lot of brands, which Marico's brands, You'll see many of these brands that are there in other emerging, Bharti Airtel.
And very often following the diaspora that you've talked about.
And then to go to the Western markets, some of them are following the diaspora. So you see Dabur and ICICI making some kind of impact there. But these are niche strategies. These are not mass strategies, I think Indian companies have no choice but to massively increase their investment in R&D and to become an innovation engine. In the long run, there is no future without that.
The Chinese brands that you're talking about are going global on the basis of technology and now innovation.
Yes.
Even the wine cooler I'm going to buy in my house is higher, actually.
Yes.
Yes. So the point is that does India have that base fundamentally in place in order to strengthen, to actually export in the same way?
Yeah. So the global consumer brands, when you go global consumer from an emerging market, by being from an emerging market, the Western market consumer thinks you are cheap and poor quality. So you have to sell your products initially by being cheaper than the Western brands, which means your costs of production have to be much lower than the Western brands. And also when you're selling a consumer brand, you also have to get distribution. To get distribution in mass retail in the Western markets requires you to have mass advertising budget. Indian companies cannot justify that kind of advertising budget, and they don't invest in R&D in the same way as the Chinese companies are doing. So pretty much today in China, there's a mandate that you have to be into R&D and you have to be into innovation. In fact, China has today become one of the biggest patent filers in the world. I mean, after USA, they're the biggest patent filer in the whole world, and they're filing patents. Now, many people say, well, the quality of these patents are not good. It's true that 90% of the patents may be poor quality, but some percentage of them are of good quality. A company like Huawei is, I think, the second largest patent filer in the world today. ZTE is a huge patent filer. Haier is a huge patent filer. So when you're trying to build a brand, advertising is important, but it's more important to have the right product and to have a unique product. And that comes through R&D. And so the Chinese companies are much more investing into R&D than Indian companies do.
So this is what you would advocate for Indian companies?
I think Indian companies have no choice but to massively increase their investment in R&D and to become an innovation engine. In the long run, there is no future without that. So they are going to have to spend a lot of energy and effort trying to do that. And you're already trying to see, like if USA spends about 3% of their GDP on R&D, China spends 1.2% and India spends 0.6%. So that's half of China and 1/5 of what America spends.
Okay, coming to the workplace also, I mean, what is the kind of Chinese companies are really not generally known for their culture, work environment, the sort of motivating environment for employees. But obviously, if there's so much innovation, branding going on, then they must be doing something to sort of spruce up their workplaces too.
So what you're seeing in Chinese companies today is less hierarchy. You're seeing great R&D investments. You're seeing an attraction of global talent, because if I want to develop a fridge for an Indian consumer like you, or I want to develop a fridge for a US consumer or for a German consumer, I need consumer insights in those markets. So what the great Chinese companies that are on this journey are doing is they're attracting global talent and they're placing them in their R&D facilities, firstly. Second thing they're doing, companies like Lenovo, Haier, Huawei, ZTE, they're setting up global R&D centers. So you'll see Huawei has a global R&D center in America. Haier has an R&D center in America. They have another R&D center in Europe. because only if I have R&D centers in these countries can I get the consumer insight into those markets. And a company like Lenovo, when I went to the R&D center, I went to 2 R&D centers of there, one in Beijing, one in Shanghai. You could not, it was almost like you were not in a Chinese company. All the signage was in English. The working language at Lenovo is English. There were interns hanging, American interns from Stanford and MIT hanging around the R&D labs and working with the Chinese people over there. So you really felt you were in an R&D lab anywhere in the world, just like when you go to the Indian IT outsourcing centers in Bangalore, you feel like you could be anywhere in the world. And the R&D centers in China, if you see of companies like Lenovo and Haier and Huawei and ZTE, they could be anywhere in the world almost. Yeah, there's an excessive amount of Chinese there compared to the rest of the world, but that would be true of the Bangalore sites over here. But it feels like a global campus.
So how this exercise of linking the brand values with corporate culture, how many companies really make that effort in your view to make sure that people in the front line or people across the organization know what the company stands for, the brand stands for, and therefore how they are supposed to perform?
Yeah, so in the great companies, now there's a difference between service companies and manufacturing companies. In service companies, it's very important that every single employee understands the brand values. Why? Because I cannot deliver a perfect Starbucks coffee unless the person who's making your coffee knows the brand values. In a manufacturing companies, this is less so. But even there, they have to understand some of the brand values, but they don't have to understand it to the same degree as a service company. Because the end user of a Procter & Gamble product does not touch the Procter & Gamble employee. There's a retailer in the middle. Yeah. The product has to deliver the brand values, not the people as much. Even though they have to understand the brand values in designing and manufacturing the product. But they don't have to understand it as deeply as in a service organization. Whereas if I'm Taj Hotels, or if I'm Oriental Hotels, or if I'm Starbucks Coffee, then if the frontline employee they are the ones who are in contact with the customer. They are the ones who are going to deliver the brand value. Even in a retail store, the customer is going to experience the brand values through their interactions with the employees. So in those cases, understanding the brand values, training the employees on how to live the brand values is absolutely critical in delivering the proposition to the customer. In a manufacturing company, less so. They need to have some idea of the brand values, but they don't have to live and breathe it the way a service company does. Every employee dreams of being the CEO. The way they see the CEO behave, the way they see their boss behave, immediate boss behave, is a very important indicator to them as to what behaviors this company values, how I'm expected to behave if I want to become the boss and ultimately the CEO. And that's how you generate the culture on a daily basis.
And how can a workplace really be an effective tool in this scenario to get the management to build that corporate culture that they need?
So in the end, if you talk about what is the role of management, the role of management is to set up the processes, to hire the talent, to run the processes, and then after that, to make the culture of the organization. So how the top management, how the CEO behaves is a very important signal to other people as to what are going to be the values of this company. So we always say the most important job of a CEO is the keeper of the culture. Because that keeper of the culture is a very important job. It doesn't mean I can't be for change, because of course I can be a keeper of the culture and still be for change, but the keeper of the culture, because every employee dreams of being the CEO. The way they see the CEO behave, the way they see their boss behave, immediate boss behave, is a very important indicator to them as to what behaviors this company values, how I'm expected to behave if I want to become the boss and ultimately the CEO. And that's how you generate the culture on a daily basis, is through behaviors. So the senior leadership, the top management, the bosses of every employee, the way they behave, that's what creates, that's what generates, that's what sustains a corporate culture over time.
But very frankly, the problem is that there's so much operational pressure, there's such a difficult external environment, there's so much complexity and uncertainty on CEOs that sometimes just how do you manage that versus taking time out to doing something like managing the corporate culture or keeping the corporate culture in mind on a day-to-day basis?
I think your question is fundamental. Your question is fundamental is only when I am under stress, only when I'm under performance pressure, only when do I have dilemmas that are facing me do I demonstrate my corporate culture. It's very easy to do the right thing when everybody is watching you and there's no pressure. It's very hard to do the right thing when there's a lot of pressure on you to perform and nobody's watching you. But that's when I'd show my corporate culture.
Any good examples you could share?
So for example, if I have 100 employees watching me when I'm walking into a hotel lobby and I see a piece of paper as a CEO and I pick it up, it's one thing. But if nobody's watching me and I see a piece of paper and I pick it up and drop it in the trash can, that's when I'm delivering my corporate culture. And that's when I'm also delivering my brand proposition. You see? So corporate culture, the great companies who have very strong corporate cultures, they breathe them. It's part of their being. It's what defines them. They don't say, this is our corporate culture. They say, this is who I am. Authentic leadership is that leadership that believes its own words, is that leadership that lives its own words, is that leadership that breathes its own words. And in those words, and then when that gap between our deeds and our words becomes small, then there's no dilemma in living the corporate culture, because what I say is what I believe, is what I do.
And do you think this would apply to the leadership of the country also?
The morning I'm going to work, I see what you call a bus, right? A public transportation bus. It says, save fuel, take public transportation. I'm sure the driver did not put that sign on the bus, right? Some top guy at BEST put that sign on the bus, right? Do you think that person is taking public transportation? It's not authentic. As we say, a rich country is not one where poor people have cars, but where rich people take public transportation. You go to London,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
You see everybody takes the public transportation, rich or poor, right? So the great need of the hour for leadership in our country is integrity, of course, number one. Authenticity, which is part of integrity. It's having a vision of how we should behave and what we want to be. It's about a sense of service, and especially a sense of service to those who have not been as fortunate as us. So we need to have that empathy that we did not get our privileged backgrounds because you and I did something. We got our privileged backgrounds because it was luck. We were born to our parents. But that means that we have a duty to serve those who have been less lucky than us.
But right now there's a view in, I think, let's say just before these results or in general in politics, that it's not public service, it's more like public ruling. It's a question of ruling the public versus serving the public.
We have to be very humble in India because there are so many challenges we face, and whether you are in a company or you're running a country, you always have to remember, for a leader, the number of challenges are infinite because there's always something that needs to be fixed. We may talk about being a superpower, but we have to remember not only how we see ourselves, but how others see us. And when you live outside and you have a global mindset, how do people see India? They say, what is this talk about a superpower? First, provide toilets for your citizens. If you can't provide toilet, you can't provide housing, you can't provide power, you can't provide clean drinking water and food for your people, the talk of a superpower, we may be a superpower, but let's be humble about it because we aren't a superpower enough to solve these basic problems for our people who really are in need, And the great leaders are ones who don't talk about their successes, but they're working on the next challenge.
And what is the biggest change that you've seen in the country after sort of living here after a long time?
The big change I see in terms of the Indian consumer psyche is they have become much more restless. That means they are much more impatient about quality. They're demanding good experiences and good products increasingly. Number two, they have become aspirational, which means instead of being obsessed as it used to be 30 years ago with price only, they are now willing to pay a higher price, but then in return they are saying, demonstrate to me what can you give me in return, right? So they have become more value conscious instead of just price conscious. And number three, the market has become more fragmented, which means that as marketers, our challenge becomes, as companies, our challenge becomes, how do we meet all these different slices of society with different value propositions within the same company? And how many can we meet of them? If I'm in Denmark with 5 million people, I can't make more than 3 segments and serve them effectively. But in India, with 1 billion plus people, I can make 50 segments and serve each of them with a unique value proposition and still make money, right? So the market has become much more restless, the market has become much more aspirational, and the market has become much more fragmented. And all of these three things are putting great challenges on companies to deliver, and they're forcing companies to up their game.
So your parting words to brand marketeers in India?
Become better, and make sure that you always remember that markets change faster than marketing.
Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.